Just drive the bus, old man. You're not in the army anymore. Laughter broke out from the back row as the crumpled ticket hit the floor. The driver didn't flinch. He simply reached down, picked it up, and kept driving. No one noticed the soldier sitting quietly in the last seat until he stood up and whispered 5 words that changed everything. What do you think those 5 words were? Drop them in the comments. Frank Douglas had been driving bus route 18 for 13 years. At 67, his movements were slower than when he'd enlisted at 19, but his discipline remained undiminished. Every morning without fail, rain or shine, holiday or workday, he arrived at the depot 20 minutes early. The other drivers joked that you could set your watch by Frank's routine. He wore the same faded Army cap every day, olive green with a barely visible 5th Infantry Division patch. The management had asked him twice to wear the standard issue bus company hat instead. Both times Frank had nodded politely and continued wearing his own. Eventually they stopped asking. A small worn photograph was taped to his dashboard, 7 young men in desert fatigues standing beside a Humvee, arms around each other's shoulders. Frank never explained it, never needed to. Each passenger who boarded received the same quiet nod, sometimes accompanied by a soft morning or afternoon. Children who forgot their fare were waved on with a gentle smile and a whispered, "Get it next time." Elderly passengers found his hand extended before they reached the steps, steady and patient as they climbed aboard. That Wednesday morning had begun like any other. The early commuters with their travel mugs and tired eyes, the high school students with earbuds and backpacks. Frank greeted each one, his voice a calm constant in their rushed mornings. At the Westfield Avenue stop, a young mother struggled with a folding stroller and a squirming toddler. Frank immediately set the brake step down and helped her navigate the narrow steps, ignoring the sighs from impatient passengers behind her. "Thank you," she whispered, a relief evident in her voice. Frank nodded. "No trouble, ma'am." At the next stop, he noticed an elderly man with a cane moving painfully slow across the crosswalk. Though the light was about to change, Frank held the bus, waiting until the man had safely boarded before pulling away from the curb. "You're a good one," the old man said as he passed. A group of teenage boys in the back row had been growing louder with each stop. Now they focused their attention on Frank's cap. "Yo, is that thing from Vietnam or a museum?" one called out, prompting snickers from his friends. Another wadded up a candy wrapper and tossed it toward the front. It landed near Frank's feet. Frank didn't react. He just drove. At the downtown transfer point, a businessman in an expensive suit checked his watch ostentatiously. "You're late again, but right away," he announced loudly. "What kind of service is this?" Frank met his eyes in the rearview mirror. "Sorry, sir. I was helping someone and get on." The man scoffed. "You're not a hero anymore, just a driver." Silence fell across the bus. Frank lowered his eyes and pressed the brake. The doors opened with a soft hiss. When he looked up again, he was still smiling at the next passenger. Gray clouds that had threatened all morning finally delivered their promise. Rain began falling in heavy sheets, drumming against the roof of the bus. Traffic thickened as drivers slowed, visibility reduced by the downpour. The windshield wipers worked overtime, sweeping back and forth in a steady rhythm that matched Frank's heartbeat. Someone cursed loudly from the back as the bus slowed for yet another red light. "Yo, Gramps, you forget how to drive," called one of the teenagers, his voice carrying over the rain. Another voice joined in mockingly. "Maybe he thinks he's driving a tank again." Frank maintained his focus on the road, hands steady at 10 and 2 o'clock on the wheel. His eyes, reflected briefly in the rearview mirror, revealed nothing, neither anger nor hurt. Just the measured concentration of a man who had driven under far worse conditions than a rainy city morning. As the light turned green, he accelerated gradually, mindful of the slick streets. The bus lurched slightly as it moved forward. Someone in the middle section deliberately dropped a soda can, its contents spilling across the floor near the front. "Oops, better call HQ, Commander," a voice taunted. Still, Frank said nothing. His silence wasn't weakness. Those who truly understood might have recognized it as the practiced restraint of someone who had learned when words mattered and when they didn't. An older woman sitting in the front row leaned forward slightly. "You don't deserve that," she whispered, just loud enough for Frank to hear. He acknowledged her with a slight nod, eyes never leaving the road. At the next stop, one of the teenagers pushed past Frank to exit, deliberately bumping his shoulder. "Dead weight, all you vets," he muttered loud enough to be heard. Frank absorbed the comment like he had absorbed everything else with the quiet dignity that comes from knowing exactly who you are and what you've done. Throughout it all, a young soldier in uniform sat quietly in the far back seat. He'd boarded at the first stop and hadn't said a word, but his eyes had missed nothing. His expression darkened with each taunt, each casual cruelty directed at the driver. As the route continued, passengers came and went. Few thanked Frank when they disembarked. Most barely acknowledged him at all. Between stops, Frank would reach down to collect trash left behind. Food wrappers, empty cups, discarded tickets. Always in silence. Always with the same methodical care he applied to everything. At the final stop on the line, the remaining passengers filed out. The bus was now empty except for Frank and the soldier in the back. Frank was about to close the door when he noticed the young man walking slowly toward the front. The soldier's boots made a distinctive sound on the bus floor, a sound Frank hadn't heard in decades but instantly recognized. The young man stopped at the top of the steps, looking directly into Frank's eyes. For a moment, neither spoke. Then the soldier said 5 words, "You still serve Sergeant Douglas." I had to start writing for a moment. That line, though, it hit hard. If you believe respect should never expire, type honor in the comments. Frank's hands froze on the wheel. The engine hummed in the background, but everything else seemed to stop. He hadn't heard his rank spoken aloud in over 30 years. How do you know me?" he stammered, the professional composure that had weathered insults and disrespect finally cracking under the weight of unexpected recognition. The young soldier stood straighter, respect evident in his posture. "Fort Bragg, 2005. My uncle served under you in the 5th Infantry. Staff Sergeant James Mercer." The name hit Frank like physical contact. Memories rushed back, sand and heat and the sound of rounds impacting metal. "Jimmy Mercer," Frank whispered. "He was a good soldier." "He still is, sir. Still talks about you. Says you saved his life in Fallujah when your convoy was ambushed. Pulled him from a burning vehicle with 3 broken ribs yourself." Frank's weathered hand trembled slightly as he reached up to touch the brim of his faded cap. "I just did what anyone would have. Your uncle, he did the real heroic stuff later." The soldier took another step forward and raised his hand in a formal salute. Frank tried to wave it off, embarrassment coloring his features, but the soldier held the position. "Sir, with respect, my uncle made me promise if I ever saw you, I'd do this. He says he owes you everything, his life, his family, all of it." At that moment, the bus doors opened again. The older woman who had whispered to Frank earlier reboarded, a determined expression on her face. "I thought that was you," she said quietly. "I volunteer at the Veterans Memorial. I've seen your name on the wall. 3 medals, wasn't it?" Frank looked down, discomfort evident in his posture. "Long time ago, ma'am. Different life." Outside the still open doors, the businessman who had complained about the late bus stood frozen on the sidewalk, briefcase in hand. He had returned to catch the return route, but now found himself witness to the unfolding scene. "Wait," he said, stepping partially onto the bus. "You were the one in that convoy ambush in 2005, the one they covered in the national news." Frank nodded reluctantly. "Wasn't just me. A lot of good men didn't make it back." The man's expression transformed, shame flooding his features. "My cousin was a Marine. Lost his leg over there." His voice softened. "I had no idea you were—" "I shouldn't have—" Words failed him, but his eyes conveyed what his voice couldn't. People began to gather at the bus door, curious about the impromptu gathering. A passenger who had exited earlier returned, phone in hand, recording the scene. Within minutes, a small crowd formed on the sidewalk. The teenagers from earlier returned, drawn by the growing crowd. They hung back, quieter now, uncomfortable as understanding dawned. One removed his cap, holding it against his chest in a gesture he probably didn't fully comprehend, but somehow knew was appropriate. The young soldier turned to address them, his voice carrying the authority of his uniform. "Show some respect," he said, not unkindly but with unmistakable firmness. This man didn't stop serving. Not then, not now. Nobody dared speak. The silence held more weight than applause ever could. Frank, overwhelmed by the sudden attention, lowered his head slightly, one hand still gripping the wheel as if it were an anchor in a storm. "I'm just doing my job," he said softly, "like always." But his eyes, when he finally raised them, held something that had been absent all morning: recognition. The next morning dawned clear, the previous day's rain leaving the world washed clean and gleaming. Bus Route 18 departed the depot at its scheduled time. Frank Douglas at the wheel, his faded army cap in its usual place. But something had changed. At every stop, someone, sometimes several people, stood and nodded respectfully to Frank as they boarded. No grand gestures, no speeches, just quiet acknowledgement. Along the route, particularly at major intersections, groups of veterans lined the sidewalk. As the bus passed, they raised their hands in salute. Frank returned each one with a slight nod, his eyes suspiciously bright. When the bus pulled into the central terminal at the end of the road, a simple banner hung from the overhead walkway. "Thank you, Sergeant Douglas, still serving." Frank parked in his designated spot, turned off the engine, and stepped out. He didn't make a speech, didn't seek attention. He simply tipped his cap and walked toward the employee entrance, his shift complete. But behind him, a figure in uniform, the same young soldier from the day before, stood at attention. Without command or urbanization, passengers who had witnessed yesterday's revelation began to form a line beside him. No applause, no music, just silence, deep and reverent. One by one, people straightened their postures, squared their shoulders, and stood a little taller in the presence of quiet courage. Some heroes don't need monuments. They just need a moment of truth. Subscribe to Wounds and Honor if you believe some men never stop serving.